Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you all back to this. I'm Alasdair Smith, a member of UKTPO. And it's a great pleasure to introduce to this session in which the main presenter is from Georgetown University, Anna Maria Mayda. Georgetown has had very close relations with UKTPO. Anna Maria is a professor of economics at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. She's a specialist in trade, international migration and political economy. And among other things, she's been senior advisor to the chief economist of the State Department. The discussant in this session is Mattia di Ubaldo, who's a research fellow at UKTPO. And before I ask Anna Maria to start her presentation, can I just remind you that the way to submit questions for Anna Maria during the session is to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So once again, welcome to all of you, and a particularly warm welcome to Anna Maria, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here and to present this paper. I'm going to share it right away. Okay, here we are. So this is a joint paper with my colleague Rod Ludema at Georgetown University, Miao J.U. at Peking University, and Ziyu at Renmin University of China. And this is a paper about the role of global value chain in determining, affecting tariffs in trade policy. So we all know that global value chains have become an important feature of the international trade landscape. And what we mean by global value chains is all those situations in which input-output relationships cross country borders. And we have, for example, upstream producers in one country, downstream producers in another country. So given that, what do we do in this paper? We ask what effect global value chains, and in particular domestic value added, has on trade policy. And we, in this paper, look not only at the economically efficient tariffs, but we also look at the political economy efficient tariffs. So we look at the impact of political organization and political calculus in affecting the role that global value chains play in trade policy. And our work is very much related to a very nice paper by Blanchard, Bown, and Johnson, where they show that both domestic value added and foreign value added affect tariffs. I will tell you more in detail how our work departs from theirs, but definitely this is the paper most related to ours. So let me start with a very simple example, a figure that explains really the setup of our paper. Consider a situation in which a country C, which might be Canada, produces certain inputs that are used in the production of an output good. The output good is shipping containers, and the inputs produced by Canada, by country C, are, for example, paint, plywood. And what Canadian producers do is to export these inputs to China, and Chinese processing firms use these imported inputs to produce a final product, shipping containers, that is then exported back all over the world, including back to Canada. In Canada, there are domestic producers of shipping containers that will demand protection, and so there will be potentially a tariff imposed by the Canadian government on shipping containers. So the question we ask, which is also the question that Blanchard, Bown and Johnson asked, is how does domestic value added, which we define as the value of the exported plywood, paint by Canadian firms to China, divided by the value of imported shipping containers. So how does this domestic value added share affect the tariff that the Canadian government imposes on Chinese shipping containers? What we add to this question is the political economy angle. So we also ask how do politically organized Canadian producers of inputs affect the tariff on shipping containers? And this is a new question in the literature that hasn't been asked. Now, again, taking a step back, let me tell you that these are important questions to ask because, as we all know, global value chains have become pervasive. And if you look at the data, domestic value added is quite large. There is a lot of variation across countries, products, and time that can be, that can have a big effect and can be exploited in terms of empirical analysis. Yet, if you look at the literature, what you will notice is that while there is a lot of work on global value chains, the work on the role of global value chains in terms of trade policy is more limited. Let me tell you exactly how our paper fits in this literature. There are some older papers that introduce global value chains in models of trade policy, but the earlier papers, for the most part, focus on tariffs imposed on inputs. So, for example, there's a very nice paper by Gawan De Krishna and Olarreaga, which is a Grossman and Helpman model with inputs. There is my paper with Rod and Prachi Mishra. Basically, in these papers, what happens is that producers of inputs want protection. So one tariff on inputs, and the downstream producers, they use those inputs instead oppose protection on inputs because otherwise they will face higher costs. So it's a pretty straightforward extension of the Grossman and Helpman model to a situation in which the consumers are politically organized, because in this case the consumers are downstream firms that use the inputs. Next, there is a strand of the literature that looks at how ownership affects trade policy. And this is, again, very related to what we do. So, for example, there is a very nice paper by Blanchard and Maschke that shows that when exports by affiliates of US multinationals to the United States increase, then the US government will be more likely to grant preferential duty-free access to the country of origin of these exports, taking into account that the goods that are coming in embody basically the American value added. Next, the paper that I was talking about before, the paper by BBJ, that's how I'm going to denote Blanchard, Bown, and Johnson. So let me first tell you that they not only look at domestic value added, but they also look at foreign value added. So they also look at the impact of foreign produced inputs embodied in domestically produced downstream products. We don't do that. We only look at domestic value added. And we construct, though, a measure of domestic value added which is much more detailed at the 6-digit level. But now, let me first use the next few minutes to give you a sense about the theory behind the intuition that domestic value added should reduce the tariff imposed by the Canadian government on shipping containers. It is a terms of trade argument. So basically, domestic value added reduces the terms of trade motive for imposing a tariff. And again, let me use a very simple figure that shows you how these terms of trade effects work. So the left figure gives you the usual graph that we use in undergrad classes to show the terms of trade effect of a tariff. It is the figure for the world market of shipping containers, the output good. There's an export supply and import demand. When the Canadian government imposes a tariff, the import demand curve will shift in, and then will reduce the international price of shipping containers, which will represent a terms of trade gain for Canada, because Canada is an importer of shipping containers. And this terms of trade gain is proportional to the value of imported shipping containers by Canada. Now, when the tariff is imposed by Canada on shipping containers and the price in international markets of shipping containers goes down, Chinese firms will want to produce fewer shipping containers, will demand fewer inputs to produce shipping containers. And so on the right-hand side, in the world market of plywood paint, there will be a shift to the left in of the import demand curve. That will reduce the international price of inputs. But in this case, this will be a terms of trade loss from the point of view of Canada, because Canada exports these inputs. And this terms of trade loss will be proportional to the value of inputs exported by Canada. So basically, the main explanatory variable in our analysis, which is the domestic value added share, which is the value of exported inputs by Canada divided by the value of imported shipping containers, gives you a measure of the relative importance of these two terms of trade effects. The bigger the domestic value added share, the greater the terms of trade loss relative to the terms of trade gain due to the tariff on shipping containers. Okay, so this is basically the argument in BBJ. What do we add to that? We add the fact that Canadian producers may not only sell to Chinese processing firms, as you see in this figure, but they may also sell to Canadian producers of shipping containers. And that complicates things, because to the extent that the inputs sold to these two markets are homogeneous, then the terms of trade dumping effect may not go through. Let's say to an extreme that Canadian producers of paint sell most of their inputs to Canadian domestic producers of shipping containers. Then the tariff on shipping containers will be good for Canadian input producers, because it will increase demand for their inputs. So the bottom line is that what we add in the optimally economically efficient tariff model is the possibility that the input producers sell to the domestic market. And the point we made is that if the inputs are homogeneous, the terms of trade dumping effect may not go through. If instead the inputs sold to these two markets are customized, then the BBJ dumping of the terms of trade effect goes through. So this is the first variant in what we do. The second variant is in terms of political economy. So we explicitly account for political economy effects both in the theoretical model and in the empirical analysis. And what we find, to give you a preview of the theoretical results, a summary of the theoretical results, is that as in all the previous literature, political organization of Canadian downstream producers of shipping containers will increase the tariff on the downstream product, so on shipping containers. The political organization of upstream producers will work differently according to what the domestic value added share is. So the higher is the domestic value added share, the less positive or the more negative the impact of political organization of upstream producers. So basically, these two groups of producers, upstream and downstream producers in Canada, will be political allies only when the domestic value added share is low. But as soon as the domestic value added share increases, then this alliance, political alliance, breaks down. So what do we do in the empirics? The nice thing is that we can use a very detailed Chinese transaction level data that allows us to construct a measure of the domestic value added share at the 6-digit level. And we also can use variation in discriminatory trade policies vis-a-vis China by 23 countries. For some of these countries, 18, we look at preferential tariffs. For 11 countries, so we look at anti-dumping duty filings. I'm not going to talk much more about the data, but I'm going to tell you what we find. So what we find, consistent with the theoretical model, is that the domestic value added share reduces the tariff unequivocally only when inputs are customized. So when the inputs sold by the Canadian input producers to the two markets are relationship specific, are different. If the inputs are homogeneous, we find an insignificant effect. And we do find evidence which is consistent with the political economy story. So we do find that political organization of downstream producers always has a pro-tariff effect, while the pro-tariff effect of political organization of upstream producers becomes smaller the higher is the deviation. Now, we need to worry about endogeneity issues. So in particular, let me show you the very first specification that we estimate, which is the specification that PBJ estimate. So this EXS is our measure of the domestic value added share. In the denominator of this measure, there is the value of imports of shipping containers by Canada, which of course will be affected by the dependent variable. So there is a clear reverse causality problem. As a matter of fact, when we estimate the OLS specifications, we get very weak effects, also insignificant effects. Because the reverse causality implies a positive effect. The biases are negative estimates towards zero. So we use an identification strategy that is based on data for the United States. The United States is not one of the countries that we analyze in the tariff regressions, so it's outside of the sample. And we use shipping rates for the United States to construct an IB for shipping rates sent by our countries of observations to China. And then we also use a measure of distance between these two countries. But this is to say that we account for the endogeneity problem. The instrument is quite involved, and when we do so, we get much more pronounced negative and significant effects. So again, this is the specification estimated also by BBJ, but what we do, which is different, is that we account for the extent of input customization, and when we do so, look at this table, what we see in the first two columns is that the impact of the EXS, which is the domestic value added share, is negative and significant when inputs are customized. But when inputs are not customized, which is the direct effect of the export share, you see this negative effect is not always significant. Also here in the anti-dumping duty regressions, this effect is not significant. So it is very important to account for the customization of inputs. Next, let me show you in the last minute the complete specification that we estimate, which is a structural specification in the sense that it's very much, very close to the theoretical predictions. This specification has a lot of sign predictions, which amazingly are consistent with what we find in the data. So signs and significance levels which are perfectly in line with the theoretical predictions. So I know I'm out of time. Let me conclude. This paper can use very detailed data to analyze the role that global value chains play in terms of trade policy determination, introducing also the political economy aspect that hadn't been analyzed by the seminal paper by Blanchard and co-authors. And we do find that political economic considerations are important. And in general, the bottom line of this paper is that global value chains can be a liberalizing force because they can break down these political alliances that push for protection. Global value chains can make it so that input producers lobby against tariffs on downstream products. I think I'm out of time, so I'm gonna stop sharing.
Anna Maria, thank you very much for a very clear presentation and for your time discipline. So over to Mattia.
Thank you very much, Alasdair. I will jump right in. So, well, thank you very much, Alasdair, but thank you very much, Anna Maria, for this extremely interesting paper. I truly enjoyed reading it. It is a very complete piece of work, and I guess it is nearly finished, probably ready for a journal submission very soon. So what I will do is I will try and wrap up the findings of your paper maybe in the first couple of slides and then provide some comments that we can use for discussion. So what is this paper about? So as we live in a world where production is fragmented across different countries and GVAs are an important feature of trade, this paper looks at the important issue of how does value added that is produced in a country and then is exported and re-imported back into that country after some processing affect the import tariff on those products that include domestic value added. So a first answer, which is the one that you mentioned, was provided by the Blanchard-bound Johnson paper, is that a higher DVA share should dampen the demand for downstream protection because that protection is against foreign value added, but also some of the domestic value added. However, and this is where the contribution of this paper comes in, is that, well, the authors say it depends. The role of the DVA share is not obvious. You know, it really depends on what happens. So the imposition of a tariff has to be evaluated against what happens to the input prices. Right, for upstream producers of inputs, which supply their inputs both at home and abroad, what really matters is what happens to the price of the inputs that they sell. Now, a tariff downstream will likely reduce demand for those domestic inputs abroad and increase demand at home. But whether the price of this input increases or decreases depends on whether the prices are actually allowed to diverge at home and abroad. And this, as the paper shows, is something that happens if the inputs are somehow specific to the markets where they're sold. In other words, if the inputs are customized to some degree. And it's only in that case that the DVA share is shown to reduce the terms of trade motive for downstream tariffs. And that's intuitively because the price of these domestic inputs abroad falls with the tariff. Things are not so easy if inputs are homogeneous. The DVA share has an ambiguous role in that case, and that's also what the paper shows. Then a second set of results are about the role of political organization, and I find the results of the organization in upstream producers very salient, because the paper shows that organization always increases the level of the optimal downstream tariff, but this is weakened. This impact is weakened as the DVA share increases, because, as mentioned, basically profits of domestic import producers fall. Their profits abroad fall with the tariff. So overall, I think this is a very carefully done piece of work. The main propositions are derived theoretically and then tested in a careful empirical analysis, where the highlight clearly is the use of these transaction level data, which allow to construct a DVA measure which is product country specific. Is a lot more detailed than what we can do with TVA or the VIOT data. And then this measure is matched to China-specific preferential tariffs and anti-dumping filings in 23 Chinese trade partners. The authors construct customization measures and political organization measures and test all these predictions in a very well explained and convincing analysis, I would say. So my comments for this paper are going to be more about sort of the possibility of qualifying some of these findings rather than invalidating them, because I guess the analysis is pretty convincing. So the first comment I have is how China-specific are the tariffs used in the analysis, right? In this application, you would like to use a measure of protection which is specific to imports coming from China, and then see how that varies with the level of the DVA share. However, most of the tariffs you use, at least the analysis on preferential tariffs, is done with GSP tariffs. Now, I don't know exactly the fraction of observations which corresponds to GSP tariffs, but these tariffs are generally granted to a very large set of beneficiaries. To give an example, the used GSP had over 170 members during the period of time you analyze. These tariffs are, mostly going to zero. At least half of them are zero. There's very few changes over time. So I wonder whether the paper could provide some motivating evidence to show that these tariffs are indeed specific to Chinese imports, or maybe the crudest way would be to try and rerun your models without GSP tariffs included in the analysis, although that might be too many data points you would be dropping in that case. And if finding sort of a China-specific tariffs is not that easy in the data, I think perhaps of the main focus of this, at least of the empirics, should be on the anti-dumping filings. There you get very clear results, and these anti-dumping duties are clearly China-specific. So I think that would be what I would buy more in terms of results. Second comment is about the fact that we observe a lot of back and forth transactions in GVCs. Now, when I was reading your paper, I kept wondering how far downstream are these products that are exported by the Chinese firms? Because if these products are still very much upstream and then undergo further processing once they are exported, well, in that case, the DVA share might not be so important in determining the imports on products which are inputs themselves of further processing. So I wonder whether you can just qualify your findings a bit more, maybe by using an upstreamness indicator, like the one developed by Antras and Shore. This is an indicator that gives you an absolute measure of upstreamness of an industry, and it's clearly an average upstreamness measure, but it could perhaps be used to break down your sample and maybe estimate your models by industries which are at different distances from final demand. And probably, I guess, your model would be more strongly verified for firms which are further downstream, therefore closer to final demand. Finally, a third set of comments. This first bullet point, customization of ownership, is something that I first thought of more as an interpretational comment, but then I thought maybe there's more to that, because you explained the role of customization very clearly in the theory, and the results and the empirical analysis also make sense. I just kept wondering how much ownership still can explain in that sense, because customization is a determinant of ownership acquisition, right, of the boundary of the firm. So, and empirically, I think these two things overlap quite a lot. So I wonder whether you could try and disentangle a bit the role of customization from that of ownership, perhaps by identifying ownership links of these Chinese exporters with firms in the countries that impose these tariffs against China. Perhaps this is not necessary. Maybe you can explain to us whether these processing with imports transactions are all arm's length transaction or not. In case they're not, there might be some value in trying to disentangle the role of ownership from that of customization, just to be a bit closer to the theoretical background of your paper, which is very convincing. And finally, a slightly more technical point on the use of country product fixed effects. You do not use fixed effects at this level in the specifications, and I believe this is because the specification would just become too demanding in terms of variation left to estimate your coefficient. But you also worry, and I see that in one of your footnotes, that you cannot control for countries' market power in each of the products. And that is something you assume in the theory for countries being able to affect the input prices. But if country product fixed effect could be used, this could be a very easy way to just take out the concern that countries' market power might be somehow confounding your estimated effects. Overall, I think this is a very, very nice piece of work. So thank you very much, Anna Maria. I think I will stop here.
Mattia, thank you very much. Anna Maria, can I suggest that you might want to address now the questions that Mattia has raised, and let me remind the audience that you can submit further questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Mattia. These are excellent comments, which we will incorporate. We are revising now the paper. You definitely point out very important issues. So we did spend quite a bit of time thinking about which dependent variable to use, whether we should focus on preferential tariffs, MFN tariffs, anti-dumping duties. With MFN tariffs, one big issue is that they don't vary much in the period that we analyzed between 2000 and 2006. They don't vary almost at all. And of course, they're not specific for China. We would have to account for the impact of WTO negotiations that would complicate things quite a bit. I should say that we tried the specification with MFN tariffs. The results are weaker, but they are there. Qualitatively, we get very similar results, more so in the cross-section, because again, there is not much time variation. But it's a good idea probably to emphasize the AD results, present them first, and de-emphasize the preferential tariffs results. In terms of your comment on upstreamness, it is a very good point. What we did in some of the newer robustness checks was to incorporate not only the direct domestic value added, which we do in our main explanatory variable, but all the different steps in global value chain, so indirect domestic value added, so the back and forth that can take place between these countries and China, also through third countries. But we haven't yet done what you suggest, which is a very good idea. In terms of ownership, we can do what you suggest because we do have the data on ownership. It's one of those things that we always say that we're going to do. We haven't done it yet, so it's a good reminder. Finally, in terms of country product fixed effects, the issue with doing that is that our political organization measures are not so detailed. They are at the 4-digit HS level, and they are therefore, if we include a country by product fixed effects, we would totally kill that variation. So we cannot include them. I take your point about terms of trade effects also because in my previous work I've worked a lot with that aspect of trade policy, and at one point we wanted to incorporate export supply elasticities, but what is true is that if we incorporated the strength of market power in trade policy, so what you're talking about, we would not get results with different signs. The effects would be still of the same sign, but with different strengths. So qualitatively, we wouldn't get different sign predictions. So we decided to focus on the aspects of the model that clearly allow us to discriminate across stories. So for example, with input customization, if the inputs are not customized, we should get 0 impacts. And so it's a much cleaner prediction to bring to the data. Or with political organization, the impact of political organization switches sign, it's a cleaner prediction. So we would have had to consider quadruple interactions if we considered inverse export supply elasticities, which seemed too much to us from the data. But I take your point, because that's a very important aspect of the model, that these are large open economies. If market power is 0, all these effects should disappear.
Thanks, Anna Maria. I mean, it's a very exhaustive answer to my comments, and I take many of the comments on your points on board. And unfortunately, it does take time sometimes to do some exercise like ownership and identifying the ownership link between firms. So I understand also why this keeps getting postponed. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Overall, a nice piece of work.
And I will ask you for the for your discussion.
Oh,
you can send the.
with pleasure, sure.
Okay, well, I have a question from Ingo, who asks, it's great to have such a granular measure of DVA, but does that raise the issue of multi-product firms that use multiple HS6 inputs for multiple HS6 outputs? And if so, how do you tackle the attribution problem of inputs to output products when you've got multi-product firms?
So we use proportionality assumptions, basically. There is this issue. So basically, you're worrying about the fact that a Chinese firm might produce 2 different products. So we basically use a proportionality assumption. We assume that the use of inputs is proportional to basically the value of the product, of the specific product produced, but we cannot do more than that. We don't have information on inputs that are used for each of the products produced. That we don't have.
Well, can I just ask add a sort of supplementary question to that? Obviously, it's important to what you've done here that you have this very disaggregated input-output data from China. Is this an unusual data set, or would do you think people would be able to do this kind of work with on other countries?
It is a very unusual data set. So we actually have access to this data set through our co-authors who are based in China. This data set is not publicly available. It has been used in the literature by a few scholars, but it is definitely a very nice data source. I think it would be hard to replicate this setting, this exercise for other countries, because the detail that we have is really exceptional. So from that point of view, we are lucky, and it's one of the main contributions of the paper, because as Mattia was saying, in the rest of the literature, the OECD TIBA database has been used, and there are 16 sectors, so much more aggregate measures of domestic value added.
Thanks. I've got a question from Alan Winters, who asks, anti-dumping duties tend to divert trade as much as reduce it. Is there any mileage in identifying the beneficiaries of this diversion? Relatedly, should one consider each importer independently or consider spillovers between them?
That's a very nice suggestion. I think, let me see. So I think we could we could take on board this type of suggestion using chat-bounds data set and these diversion effects. We haven't done that yet, but you're right. Besides the direct effects that we look at, diversion is another first order impact that we maybe in another paper could analyze. That's a nice suggestion, and I think we do have the data to do so.
I have another question, which is basically I suppose an expositional question. You start off by presenting an argument based on optimal tariff calculations, and there's a sort of slight dissonance between using optimum tariff analysis as for your starting point, and then political economy analysis for the main part of your analysis. Could you, just as a matter of exposition, use a cruder account of the initial motivations for tariffs? After all, if there aren't terms of trade effects, you'll just get simple quantity effects, but you would get the same. You could have a much simpler story about tariffs, that tariffs are good for your domestic producers because they expanded the market. They're bad for your domestic upstream suppliers because they reduce their market. So a simpler quantity-based story could be an alternative launch pad for your political economy analysis.
I see. In this we follow the literature that really emphasizes these terms of trade channel. But what you're saying is that then surely in the empirical analysis, for example, as Mattia said, we don't incorporate data on export supply elasticity, so why not present the main effects in simpler terms and jump directly to the political economy part. That's I see the point. I think we wanted to be as close as possible to what had been done already in the literature from this point of view.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna Maria. Thank you again for a really interesting paper, and Mattia, thank you for your comments. And between you, you've managed to keep the session exactly to time, so we finish on time, and we'll now take we can take a 6-minute break as a result of excellent timekeeping, and the next session will start at 3:45.
Thank you.
Thank you all.